August 1998, a conference room on the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington. A camera is recording. The most valuable man in American business is sitting in a leather chair, gently rocking back and forth, wireframe glasses catching the overhead light, a sweater visible at the edge of the frame. He is being asked simple questions about emails he wrote. He does not recall. The word is ambiguous. He is not sure what he meant. The Department of Justice attorneys across the table are visibly losing patience. The judge watching the tapes the following spring in a federal courtroom in Washington will be visibly unimpressed. Segment by segment, the deposition will be played in open court. Reporters will describe the performance as evasive, petulant, almost theatrical in its refusal to engage. Editorial cartoonists will have a field day. The press, for the first time in 2 decades, will begin to seriously revise the public picture of Bill Gates. Now freeze the frame, because the man performing strategic forgetfulness on that tape is the same man who, in internal Microsoft strategy, emails entered into evidence during that exact trial, wrote with the surgical precision of a corporate war planner about cutting off Netscape's air supply. Who described in writing the competitive logic of integrating Internet Explorer into Windows so deeply that removing it would break the operating system? Who ran Saturday strategy reviews where senior executives were dressed down, in writing, for failing to anticipate competitive threats fast enough? The public Gates and the internal Gates are not the same person, and the gap between them is not an accident. It is one of the most valuable strategic assets ever held by a single operator in the history of American technology. Strategic camouflage, the competitive advantage of being consistently underestimated. When opponents see a hobbyist where a litigator stands, when regulators see a programmer where a platform strategist operates, every tactical move you make lands inside their assumption gap. That gap is the moat. That gap is the entire story. This is not a video about a nerd who got lucky. It is a video about what happens when one of the most strategically aggressive operators of the 20th century discovers that the most valuable competitive asset he owns is the public's persistent refusal to believe he is dangerous. Bill Gates did not outprogram his competitors. He outcontracted them, outlicensed them, outstandardized them, and outweighted them. And by the time anyone with regulatory authority understood what had been built, the standards were already locked. The file formats were already universal. The operating system was already the default on 9 out of 10 desktops in the developed world. And the only remaining question was whether the United States government had the legal architecture to undo what had been done. It did not. To understand the operator, start with the household. William Henry Gates III is born in Seattle in 1955 to a corporate attorney father whose dinner table conversations are structured around argumentation, evidence, and the orderly construction of a case, and to a mother whose civic network includes the chairman of IBM. The legal mind and the institutional access are both inherited. He is sent to Lakeside School, where in 1968 a parent association raises money for a teletype terminal connected to a General Electric mainframe. Gates is 13 years old. By the time he is 16, he has logged more programming hours than almost any adult professional in the country. With a slightly older student named Paul Allen, he forms an early business called Trafo Data, processing traffic data for municipal governments. He goes to Harvard. He spends most of his time in the computer lab. In January 1975, the cover of Popular Electronics shows the Altair 8800, the first personal computer aimed at hobbyists. Gates and Allen call the manufacturer in Albuquerque and offer to provide a basic programming language interpreter for the machine. They do not yet have one. They write it in 8 weeks on a borrowed mainframe without ever touching the actual hardware. Gates flies to Albuquerque, the demo works, the deal is made, and in November 1975 he drops out of Harvard. He is 19. But the moment that matters most in the early biography is not the dropout. It is February 1976. Gates writes an open letter to the members of the Homebrew Computer Club, the legendary Silicon Valley hobbyist group that includes the future founders of Apple, and accuses them, in print, of stealing Microsoft's BASIC interpreter by passing copies of the paper tape between members. He demands payment. He argues against the entire prevailing ethic of the early personal computing community that software is property, that copying it without compensation is theft, and that the future of the industry depends on this principle being enforced. He is 20 years old. He has almost no business yet, and he is articulating a strategic thesis that virtually no one else in the room shares. The strategic operator is not built by Microsoft's success. He is already running the system before the company has its first major customer. Now, 1980. IBM, the largest and most powerful computer company in the world, decides to enter the personal computer market on a compressed timeline. They need an operating system. They visit Digital Research, the dominant supplier of the era, and the meeting goes badly. The legend involves a non-disclosure agreement that Digital Research's founder refuses to sign on the spot. IBM, on a deadline, walks across the country to Microsoft. Gates does not actually have an operating system. He buys one, a product called QDOS, from a small Seattle company called Seattle Computer Products for $75,000, rebrands it MS-DOS, and licenses it to IBM. And here is the clause. Microsoft retains the right to license MS-DOS to any other manufacturer that wants to build IBM-compatible hardware. Non-exclusive. IBM agrees because IBM is thinking about a single product cycle. Gates, working with Microsoft attorney Bill Newcomb, is thinking about an industry. Within 5 years, the clone manufacturers, Compaq, Dell, dozens of others, have eaten IBM's market position, and every single one of them is paying Microsoft a per-unit licensing fee for the operating system. The clause that IBM did not understand the implications of is, by the end of the 1980s, generating revenue at a scale that exceeds IBM's own personal computer division. This is contractual asymmetry applied at industry-defining scale. Gates did not negotiate that contract the way most 25-year-old founders negotiate contracts. He negotiated it the way an antitrust attorney would, 20 years before the antitrust attorneys arrived. He flew home commercial coach. If you are still with me at this point in the video, and you have not yet subscribed to Billionaire Logic, this is the moment. What follows next is the part where the strategic operating system meets the open market, the federal government, and the limits of what American antitrust law could absorb in a single decade. The Windows standardization war. The OEM contracts that the Justice Department would later describe as designed to suppress competition. The browser ambush against Netscape. The deposition tapes. The findings of fact. The breakup order. The appeal. The settlement. And the philanthropic pivot that came after. If you want the analytical version of that story, the one that respects your intelligence and skips the cliché, subscribe and stay for the part of the video that actually earns the rest. Windows ships in 1985. By most contemporary technical assessments, it is inferior to the Apple Macintosh interface released the year before. This does not matter. Gates does not win the graphical user interface war on interface quality. He wins it on the OEM bundle and the per-processor license. Pricing structures so elegantly hostile to competition that they did not need to be illegal to be devastating. Under the per-processor license, computer manufacturers paid Microsoft a fee for every machine they shipped, regardless of whether that machine actually ran Windows. If a manufacturer wanted to offer a non-Microsoft operating system on some of its machines, they paid Microsoft anyway. The economics made it irrational to ship anything else. This was friction engineering at the level of contract structure, and for a decade it was perfectly legal. By 1995, Windows is on roughly 9 out of 10 personal computers in the world. The standardization moat is built. File formats .doc, .xls, PPT are the universal vocabulary of office work. The API set that application developers must target if they want to reach a meaningful market is owned by one company. And Gates, watching the rise of a small Mountain View company called Netscape that has just gone public on the strength of a web browser, recognizes immediately that the platform layer he has spent 15 years constructing is now, for the first time, structurally vulnerable. If applications move to the browser, the operating system stops being the layer that matters. In December 1995, he writes the Internet tidal wave memo. The entire company pivots in a quarter. What follows is the Embrace, Extend, Extinguish playbook applied at speed. Microsoft develops Internet Explorer, bundles it free with Windows, threatens OEMs who feature Netscape on their machines, integrates the browser so deeply into the operating system that, by the time of the antitrust trial, Microsoft engineers will testify under oath that Internet Explorer cannot be removed from Windows without breaking the operating system. The phrase embrace, extend, extinguish. Adopt an open standard, add proprietary extensions, then leverage distribution to make the proprietary version the default until the open standard is structurally obsolete, was not invented by hostile journalists. It came from internal Microsoft strategy documents and was entered into evidence during the antitrust trial. The antitrust trial. Tell me in the comments, do you think Gates was primarily a builder who had to become a fighter, or a fighter who happened to build something extraordinary? The Department of Justice files suit in May 1998. The findings of fact issued by Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson in November 1999 described Microsoft as a monopoly that engaged in anti-competitive conduct to maintain its monopoly. Jackson orders the company broken into two pieces, an operating system company and an applications company. The order is overturned on appeal in 2001, partly because of procedural problems caused by Jackson's own out-of-court comments to journalists, and the eventual settlement leaves Microsoft intact but constrained, subject to consent decrees that limit certain bundling and contractual practices going forward. The conventional reading is that Microsoft won the appeal and survived the antitrust crucible. The strategic reading is more interesting. The system Gates had been operating for 15 years was not interrupted by the Justice Department. It had simply been running so effectively for so long against a regulatory architecture so unprepared for software platforms that the federal government became a competitor of last resort. The deposition performance, the rocking, the strategic forgetfulness, the surgical evasion on the meaning of common English words was not panic. It was a calculated trade. Accept short-term reputational damage in the deposition phase in exchange for limiting evidentiary specificity in the trial phase. It did not work as cleanly as Microsoft's lawyers hoped, but it was a strategic decision made by an operator who had been running at the edge of the regulatory envelope for 15 years and had finally encountered the envelope's hard edge. Meanwhile, on a parallel track that received almost none of the press attention the browser war received, Microsoft was using its privileged access to its own operating system APIs to build Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, into a productivity suite that systematically destroyed Lotus 1-2-3 in spreadsheets, WordPerfect in word processing, and Harvard graphics in presentations. The competitors had, in many cases, technically superior products. They did not have early access to the API changes coming in the next version of Windows. They did not have the bundling leverage. They did not have the standardization advantage that came from owning the platform their products ran on. By 2000, the application layer belonged to Microsoft as completely as the operating system layer. Same strategy, executed one layer up. In January 2000, Gates steps down as CEO of Microsoft. 2000 is also the year of the antitrust ruling. What happened next is usually told as a redemption arc. The monopolist becomes the philanthropist. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, established in 2000, becomes over the following 2 decades the largest private charitable institution in human history, with an endowment that exceeds the gross domestic product of dozens of nations. Its work in global health, vaccine distribution, malaria reduction, polio eradication, has saved a documented and significant number of lives. Its work in education and agricultural development has reshaped policy in dozens of countries. By any honest measure, the humanitarian outputs are enormous and real. But the strategic reading suggests something more nuanced than a second act. The same operating system that built Microsoft is visible in the foundation structure, standardization applied to vaccine logistics, platform leverage applied to international development partnerships, network effects applied to global health policy through the structuring of relationships with the World Health Organization, with national governments, with pharmaceutical manufacturers. The foundation is not a different operator running a different system. It is the same operator redeploying the same system against a different problem set at a scale that exceeds the policy capacity of most national governments. This is not a criticism, it is a description. And it is also why the foundation has attracted the legitimate critical attention it has. Not because its outputs are not enormous, but because private wealth deployed at the scale of small nation-states raises real questions about democratic accountability that no quantity of saved lives fully resolves. The script is not going to resolve those questions for you. The same applies to the other shadows on the record, the antitrust verdict and what it actually said about Microsoft's conduct, Paul Allen's published account of his own treatment during his cancer diagnosis, the documented internal culture of confrontational management at Microsoft through the 1990s, the meetings with Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein's first conviction, and the contradictions in the various public timelines offered to explain them, the divorce from Melinda French Gates and the reporting around its causes, the conspiracy ecosystems that grew around Gates during the COVID pandemic. These are not detours, they are the inevitable friction generated by operating strategic systems at a scale that exceeds individual moral architecture. The narrator presents the structure, the viewer completes the verdict. So what is the structural lesson of Bill Gates? 5 things delivered as one continuous argument, because the viewer has already lived through the evidence. 1. Own the layer above the layer everyone is fighting over. While the personal computing industry fought over hardware specifications in 1980, Gates positioned Microsoft on the operating system layer above the hardware. While the world fought over operating system features in 1990, Microsoft was already using the OS layer to dominate the application layer above it. The pattern is not about software. It is about identifying where margin and control compound and getting there before the people currently competing for visibility have understood that the visible fight is not the real fight. 2. Contracts are weapons, not paperwork. The single most valuable decision in Microsoft's history was a non-exclusive licensing clause negotiated in 1980 by a 25-year-old who had been raised at the dinner table of a corporate attorney. Founders who treat legal documents as administrative friction routinely give away the leverage that decides the next 20 years. The ones who treat contracts as the primary battlefield often win without ever appearing to fight. 3. Standardization is a moat that competitors cannot reason around. Once your file format is the default, your API is the default, your operating system is the default, the question is no longer whether your product is better. The question is whether the competitor can survive the cost of asking customers to break compatibility. Most cannot. Network effects are not a marketing concept. They are the strategic surface on which entire industries are won, and Gates understood this 15 years before the term was in common business use. 4. Being underestimated is a competitive asset, and most operators throw it away by trying to look impressive. Gates was photographed in sweaters and glasses, while internal Microsoft was running an operation the federal government would eventually classify as a monopoly. The mismatch was not deception in the simple sense. Gates genuinely was the technologist the public saw. He was also the operator the depositions revealed. Both versions were real. The strategic move is not to perform either one. It is to let observers see the version that suits the moment and to never spend energy correcting the version that suits them better than it suits you. 5. Strategic operating systems do not retire. They redeploy. Gates did not stop being Bill Gates when he stepped down from Microsoft in 2000. The same pattern recognition, the same platform thinking, the same relentless analytical pressure was simply applied to a different problem set. The competitive advantages that built Microsoft are the same competitive advantages that, deployed against malaria, polio, and the architecture of global vaccine distribution, have saved a documented number of lives no one in the original Homebrew Computer Club could have imagined. That is not a redemption arc. It is the same operator with a different target. Return now to the deposition room. August 1998, the conference room in Redmond. The camera is still recording. The man in the chair is still rocking gently, glasses still catching the overhead light, sweater still visible at the edge of the frame. The simple questions are still being asked. The surgical evasions are still being delivered. The Justice Department attorneys are still losing their patience. But you are watching the tape differently now. That performance was never the sound of a man under pressure. It was never confusion or panic or a witness in over his head. It was the sound of a strategic operating system doing exactly what it was built to do, managing one more variable in one more contested environment with one more set of opponents who were still operating on the assumption that the man across the table was the man on the magazine cover. The most legally consequential software monopoly in American history was built by a man whose greatest competitive advantage, from the day he wrote that letter to the Homebrew Computer Club at age 20 until the day he sat for that deposition at age 42, was the persistent, durable, almost unkillable refusal of his opponents to believe that the polite man in the sweater was the operator he actually was. That is the lesson. That is the architecture. That is Bill Gates. If this changed the way you see him, send it to one person who still thinks Microsoft won by writing better code, and subscribe to Billionaire Logic. Because the next operator we map built something even harder to see clearly than this one.